I think I would begin the conversation by saying, well, what can we do that does not require us to use force? Because when we use force, our experience tells us, we let loose all kinds of unintended consequences. So are there ways to help, to provide aid and assistance that doesn't require dropping bombs on people?
Andrew Bacevich's latest book, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. In this latest work, Bacevich examines how, within a mere quarter of a century, America has ended up with gaping inequality, permanent war, amoral madness, a raging and alienated populace, and the strangest president in US history. Yet it has provided, yes, some satirical material for SNL, but the situation that America finds itself in is anything but a laughing matter. To help us navigate this complex series of events, tonight we are delighted to have with us journalist and host of Open Source Radio, known for print and television, Chris Lydon, who will moderate tonight's discussion. Please welcome Chris Lydon and Andrew Bacevich.
Just one request. Don't read the New Yorker interview. I think I blew it. I'm puzzled by why. Okay, because he's going to confront me with it. I'm puzzled why it's such a difficult time answering a fairly straightforward question. So the book came out a week ago today. As these things go, that means for the past week I've been almost constantly on the radio, on the TV, giving book talks. And it brought to mind, I was thinking this morning, how do people run for president? Because they experience what I've experienced for the past week after week after week. It's exhausting. I don't know how they do it. But I'm grateful that you're here. I would suggest that there are multiple ways, multiple approaches to reading my book. And let me say very plainly, I hope you will read my book. I hope you might consider buying my book. And from one point of view, it's an explanation of how we got Trump. From another point of view, it's a history, a concise narrative of the post-Cold War era. That's a phrase, post-Cold War era, that recurs throughout the book, referring to the roughly quarter-century-long interval between the fall of the Berlin Wall in October 1989 and the election of November 2016. Now, we know the several decades that came beforehand as the Cold War. The period that began with the election of Donald Trump has not yet acquired an agreed-upon name, although I am confident that it will not be called the Age of Trump. But my focus in this book is on what came between, the sequence of events that took the nation from a moment of ostensibly unprecedented triumph, when the future seemed ours to define, to a moment when a profoundly divided electorate installed as president someone manifestly ill-equipped for the office. Now, mine is necessarily a provisional account. Future historians will provide their own interpretations of the post-Cold War era, no doubt at far greater length than I have in the Age of Illusions. If you want the 600-page doorstop version of the period, just wait a few years. But I provide the essence of the story now and in just a bit more than 200 pages. The overarching theme of that story is hubris. What happens when an arrogant policy elite suddenly fancies itself relieved of constraints and called upon to define the future of humankind? That describes the immediate response to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And with perfect timing, the scholar Francis Fukuyama captured the mood of the moment in 1989 when he published an essay called The End of History. Now, the editor of the journal in which the essay appeared inserted a question mark after history, as if Fukuyama were posing a question. In fact, an exclamation point would have been more appropriate, as members of the policy world quickly leaped to the conclusion that the end of the Cold War signified something very profound indeed. The field was now wide open for the United States to define the history that was to follow the end of history, so they believed. America had won the Cold War, and the United States would now determine what was to come next, not only for Americans, but for the planet as a whole. Note the dubious and indeed dangerous assumptions embedded in those last two sentences. One is the notion that the Cold War itself defined the essence of global history in the latter half of the 20th century, with all other matters relegated to the status of afterthought. The second was that we had won, triumphed, prevailed, vanquished the adversary, and were therefore in a position to reap the rewards. With the benefit of hindsight, I've come to believe that the Cold War was not a contest to be won so much as to be endured. It was a vast and arguably unnecessary tragedy, which the United States managed to survive. The proper response to the end of the Cold War was not celebration, but repentance. But that is not the interpretation that prevailed after the Berlin Wall went down. Now let us acknowledge that Americans have an affinity for hubris that predates the passing of the Cold War by several centuries. The conviction that it is incumbent upon America to determine the course of history has a long pedigree. We can trace its origins at least as far back as John Winthrop's famous Sermon of 1630, when he charged his doughty band of followers with establishing a city upon a hill destined to illuminate the entire globe. Well, that claim came roaring back after 1989, when it appeared that no obstacles remained to prevent the United States from completing its providentially assigned saving mission. Pursuant to that mission, 4 big ideas emerged to form the basis of U.S. policy in the wake of the Cold War. And at the risk of spoiling the story for you, those ideas were, first, a belief in the capacity of corporate capitalism operating on a global scale to create unprecedented wealth in which all would share. The one-word name for this was globalization. Second, a belief in American military supremacy, thought to be beyond challenge, to serve as an instrument enabling the so-called indispensable nation to keep order and spread American values. Third, a belief in a radically expanded conception of individual freedom unmoored from traditional norms. This new definition of freedom was heavy on rights and privileges, and notably light on duties and obligations. Fourth, a belief that history had charged the President of the United States with serving as the great helmsman who would preside over all that was to come next, with the White House now GHQ of the entire universe. All four of these ideas were laced with faith in the transformative effects of information technology. God might be dead, but we had Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Google et al. To fill the void left by his departure. It fell to the three presidents of the post-Cold War era, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, to translate these ideas into actual policy. I do not mean that those three presidents subscribed to an identical worldview. I do mean that all three found themselves called upon to fulfill a set of expectations that policy intellectuals had foisted upon an unsuspecting public. With what results? Well, I don't want to give away the punchline, but let me just say that we ought to see the election of 2016 as a referendum on that post-Cold War agenda. In sufficient numbers to install Donald Trump in the White House, voters, their numbers effectively augmented by citizens who couldn't even be bothered to vote, they said no to the economic disparities stemming from globalization. They said no to the endless wars resulting from the misuse of American military power and the abuse of American soldiers. And they said no to the alienation and anomaly that were byproducts of discarding traditional moral norms. So they handed power to a mountebank who promised to make America great again. We can argue about the myriad factors contributing to Hillary Clinton's defeat, to include her own failings, but the outcome of the election represented a decisive repudiation of the core elements comprising the post-Cold War consensus. The anger expressed daily by columnists in the New York Times or hosts on MSNBC and CNN testifies to a continuing refusal to acknowledge that repudiation. Trump's election instantly plunged the United States into a political crisis that will not end until he leaves office. Indeed, my expectation is that the crisis will persist after he departs office, simply because few members of our political establishment are willing to own up to why he became president in the first place. In other words, Trump is not cause, but consequence of that crisis. He won because a set of propositions expected to define history after the end of history failed egregiously. And the beginning of wisdom, in my estimation, lies in facing up to that central truth. Only then will it be possible to take on the difficult task of healing our divisions and charting a path forward, a path based on reality rather than on a fanciful misreading of history's actual intentions, which will remain hidden as always. Thank you very much.
We could quit right there, or we could talk all night, and I think we'll talk all night, okay? Forgive me, Andy, it's a real pleasure to be with you and to read this book. I've read all of your books, and I think I like this one best. It's immensely useful. It's right up there with a book called Ill Fares the Land by Tony Judt. I don't know that you've read it. It's a wonderful compendium, but also it comes to serious points. I like the last one very, very much, that the post-Cold War period and culture is a cultural and spiritual place. It's not about weapons or war or even communism or Russia. It's a zone of this kind of crazy, exaggerated worship of the word freedom in too many dimensions, etc. But where's to begin? I just want to say also that I'm a little older than Andy, but we're wrestling with the same problem all the time. We are come out of the post-war America. Incredible promise, victory, unscathed by war virtually, and look where we are. And so many disturbing things in that obviously complex record, but very few public people to embrace unqualifiedly. JFK, of course, was the great prince and the great visionary in certain ways, but it was a vision that came a cropper in Vietnam, and it was his own fault. Similarly, Barack Obama gave us another incredible blossoming of hope and decency and American goodness, and yet so much of it is gone. How do you describe to yourself, but to the grandchildren, Grandpa, what happened in your time? You guys had it all, in personal, almost family terms.
Well, I think I would begin by saying that my generation, me specifically, allowed the Cold War to cloud our vision, cloud my vision. I certainly believe that the Cold War defined contemporary history. The two phrases were interchangeable: Cold War, history. And therefore, as a young man growing up, I was oblivious to any number of other vectors of change that deserved far more attention than they deserved. I'll give you one very specific example that we are now all aware of, and that is the expectation that there was no end to the amount of punishment we could inflict upon nature pursuant to our desire to achieve a way of life rooted in material possessions and continuous personal mobility. It simply did not occur to me that there was a limit to the punishment that the planet could absorb. And I wouldn't think about that because, again, as far as I was concerned, history was defined by this face-off between the United States and the Soviets, the free world and the communist world, the godly people and the godless people. So I almost feel like I need to apologize to my grandchildren for having grown up and absorbing this incredibly distorted and narrowing vision of what contemporary history is all about. If you accepted that vision, therefore, you became susceptible to the triumphalism that marked the end of the Cold War. You know, the notion that we won, and that having won, we were in a position of dominion. And that if we won, if we thereby demonstrated our superiority over the Soviet system, it followed that we possessed the wisdom now to act upon our victory in ways that were going to simply lead to other benefits for ourselves and for others. And this was a terrible, incorrect, utterly wrong perception, I now believe.
I wonder how you came to it, in the sense that this is the American exceptionalist view. You know, empires rise and fall, but we're something special. We're freedom in the world. We're a deeply good, wonderful, rich country, blah, blah, blah. And that the rules don't apply to us. How did that come to prevail in your important young head over everything else you knew, which was that this is my Father's world, this is God's world. We are the infinite delight of our Maker, but we're also flawed and in need of correction, and that we're not going to save this world. We need to be saved, etc. All of the religious values of restraint, humility, a deeper, more grown-up understanding. How did you or I?
I've never been asked these questions before, I have to tell you.
Wow, good.
But I think the answer is, so I grew up, I am a practicing Catholic, growing up in the 1950s and the 1960s. From a Catholic perspective, the 50s are the time when we conclude that we are now fully accepted as members of America, of society. We have achieved equality. And this itself was cause for celebration. I still love to watch Going My Way with Bing Crosby. But I think that...
He worked our parish at Sacred Heart Church in Newton Center, Massachusetts. That was it.
But I think that was its own version of triumphalism, and therefore made Catholics like me more willing to conform to the American project in its myriad manifestations, and less willing or less able to think critically about that project. Now, the fact that I went to West Point and became a professional soldier did not exactly encourage me to embark upon critical thinking. And I must say it was only after I left the Army, became a civilian, Cold War has now ended, I no longer exist in the womb of this all-encompassing institution as a member of the military profession, that at least it became possible for me to begin to think somewhat differently. And I think that's where the post-war, the recognizing the existence of this post-Cold War consensus that I've tried to describe, and coming to see the deficiencies of that consensus, whether we're talking about political economy or military policy or culture, that then led me to begin to think much more critically about my own country than I had been able to do as a younger man. Perhaps because I had spent a considerable time as a soldier, I became preoccupied in particular with the misuse of American military power. The embarking upon misguided wars, the mismanagement of our wars, perhaps most of all, what I perceive to be the obliviousness of the American people to those wars. You know, here we're in 2020. The Afghanistan war began in 2001. It continues. We now know, thanks to the so-called Afghanistan papers that were published by the Washington Post, whatever it was 3 weeks ago, that we have been lied to about the supposed progress. We know that the people charged with managing the war knew that they didn't know what was going on. And what's striking to me, one striking thing to me is, that was like 3 weeks ago. The Afghanistan papers were a big story for what? 3 days, 4 days?
You did a wonderful show with us on the radio about it. Thank you.
But since then, we moved on.
Well, I wonder. No, that to me that goes into the sort of the riverbed of guilt and sadness and disillusionment that stays there for a very, very long time, and we don't know yet what it produces. I think it was part of what produced Trump. But stick with the, I don't want to sound like two old altar boys exactly, but it seems to me, I want to know who you blame for this. And if you don't want to say, I want to guess. But I also want to...
I don't want to say, you guess.
Well, no, but I mean, the only president in my time that you could really fall in love with was John Kennedy, and he started a war knowing absolutely that it was wrong. And it's in his diaries in the early 50s in Vietnam. Brother Robert, the same thing. This was a French colonial project, and we will get chased out of here. It's in their young handwriting, and yet they embarked on it. We killed 2 million Vietnamese people for what? So my great God is my great deceiver, great illusion. This to me is enough to, and then we got through the Fulbright hearings, a real kind of good confession of our failures. John Kerry, you know, who's going to be the last man to die for a mistake? Parenthetically, I can't resist this. John Kerry, against every kind of odds, becomes a senator, chairman of that committee. Never held hearings on Iraq, for which he voted yes and voted no. I mean, something ghastly has happened to the public weal in that short series of
But your question began
disillusionment.
with who do you blame?
Who do you blame?
So when I was a young apprentice historian, I have to say that I believed in the great man theory of history. That if you want to understand the trajectory of events, well, then you need to look at Lincoln. You need to look at Woodrow Wilson. You need to look at John F. Kennedy. I no longer buy that at all. And I think that even those figures who, from our point of view, seem to wield significant authority, I think that they themselves are creatures of other forces that limit the freedom of action that they can exercise, that strongly influences the choices they make within that limited range, and therefore it becomes necessary to ask, what are the forces that define those limits? And that brings me back to my theory of the post-Cold War era. I don't blame George W. The Iraq War of 2003, the decision to invade, was an epic mistake for which we are still paying and peoples of the Middle East are still paying. We unleashed chaos. I don't blame George W. Bush for that.
Why not?
Because what I blame is the mindset that had come to exist by 2001, when 9/11 occurred, by the time we get to 2003, a mindset that said, we're strong. Nobody's as strong as we are. We're smart. Nobody's as smart as we are. We can fix this. American soldiers can fix this. Let's invade this country, let's overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime, and we're going to fix things. Well, I mean, the arrogance, in retrospect, the arrogance is absolutely stupefying. And I think that in many respects, Bush, I would make the same point about Clinton before and Barack Obama after, were responding to the circumstances in which they found themselves. Yes, they wanted to maneuver. Obama, I think, is a very good example. Remember, he runs for the presidency, denounces the Iraq War as stupid, describes the Afghanistan war as necessary, vows that he will end the Afghanistan war, he'll win the Afghanistan war if elected, becomes president. And I think from the point of view of using force, his presidency is also a disaster. Not only because calling an end to the American war in Iraq allows forces of disorder in the form of ISIS to run amok, not only because his expectation of being able to surge U.S. forces in Afghanistan and that would bring order there, that was foolish, but even more so. Remember, it was Obama who bought into the notion of overthrowing Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, after which Libya becomes chaos. It was Obama. You know, we are upset, we rightly upset, I am upset about the Soleimani assassination by this president. It was Obama who institutionalized the notion of assassinating people we don't like without anybody's authority. You're not checking with Congress first. You're killing people because you decide that they pose a problem to the United States of America. Why did he do that? I think because he was operating within this post-Cold War frame, which imposed on presidents these exaggerated expectations of what force, our force, can accomplish politically.
Jump in a sec. I think we go in the same general direction. We hold the ones we like the best most responsible. JFK for not saying, of course we're getting out of Vietnam.
Well, see, I'm not necessarily sharing your affection for John Kennedy, but okay, go ahead.
James Reston, when he was being nominated at San Francisco, said this is sex without love around the subject of John F. Kennedy, the Democratic Party. I was totally enthralled. Big Irish family. This was a thoroughbred. Okay, but he made a horrific mistake, and it was one of just intellectual honesty.
It wasn't just one mistake. He made multiple mistakes.
Okay, I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying the ones I blame are the ones that knew better, and I think Obama knew better. But when you just think about it, what has most changed in this 50-year roughly period that we've been around thinking about it is there's something in the establishment values of this country, and they have lost, to my observation, every bit of sort of the moral authority that we used to count on. I mean, Father Hesburgh or Billy Graham or whatever your denomination, Martin Luther King, these were people of serious reflection, and you could sort of turn to them, agree or not, but there was a rule. It's funny, the New York Times is going to announce on Sunday their presidential preference. And the New York Times had moral authority in my college years. And James Reston and Tom Wicker, Anthony Lewis, people like, they're no longer there. And even the question of who they're going to endorse, it's sort of, they gave you Hillary the last time. Give me a break. And they rant and rave about Trump all the time, but they never accept their responsibility for, should we say, incubating the Trump reaction. But in any event, the question, and I don't want to get too churchy at all either, but I mean, where is the compass that says, cool your jets, America, you're a blessed country, but that's about it in terms of your writ to beat up the world?
I mean, which individuals speak with that kind of moral authority?
I'm just thinking, it's hard to find a villain, least of all George W. Bush, who doesn't know any better at all. It was the worst thing that could possibly have happened.
Why do we have to look for villains? Again, why
hold accountable, to say, in a simple, pragmatic review of the situation, that was a bad idea, or that was a bad leader, or that was a bad decision.
Well, don't confuse the two. I mean, in other words, yes, let's be able to say that was a bad idea. Let's not worry about that's a bad person. Let's focus on the bad ideas.
Right. I'm going the same way. But what is it in the consensus judgment of our country that has lost its standards, its spine, its articulation?
Is I don't know an acceptable answer?
Yeah, it's okay.
I mean, the burden of my, maybe a submerged theme of my book. The Cold War was a terrible period in world history. The Cold War caused us to do any number of stupid things, and some of them fall right in the lap of your favorite president, John Kennedy, and it's not just Vietnam.
I'm not calling him my favorite president. He's the most tragic failure of a huge promise.
But I suggest in the book that, in an odd sense, the Cold War served a useful purpose in curbing our most extreme tendencies as a people. Because we believed we had to focus on the main game. The main game was, what are you going to do about, how are you going to prevent the Soviets from invading Western Europe? How are you going to prevent World War III from happening? So we couldn't stray too far off the sensible course. Once the Cold War ended, those self-imposed constraints go away. And we persuade ourselves, to me, our intellectual policy elites, persuade ourselves that we can do anything we darn well please, and we will achieve success. We will transform the world in our own image. I think you can make a strong case that the Americans have always wanted to transform the world in their own image. For a considerable period of time, we thought we would do that by providing an example for others to mirror. But after the Cold War, we're not talking about example. We're talking about shoving it down their throat, and do it in very forceful ways that elicited then enormous resentment on the part of Arabs, Iranians, Russians, Chinese, you name it. So it is this enormous arrogance that
Right.
was one of the preeminent qualities of the post-Cold War era that it seems to me, led us down the wrong path. Again, I'm not blaming people. I'm looking at ideas and attitudes that shaped policies.
Something happened after the end of the Cold War. We didn't really extend much, what's to say, I don't mean to say help, but encouragement, embrace to the old enemy. And it's been sort of U.S. force projection ever since. And it's been one awful moral and political embarrassment after another. Worse than that, but serious. What has not caught up with either our own consciences or observation of what we're doing, or the world, that this has not, we have not been told in no uncertain terms, we are not amused, we are not encouraged. It's funny, Evan Osnos' wonderful piece in the New New Yorker, or the last New New Yorker, on China. They joke about it in China. You talk democracy, and your exhibits are Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq. This is a promise to the world. Why hasn't the world said to us more unmistakably, guys, you're way, way off the beam?
I suspect that behind closed doors, they are reaching that conclusion.
I'm sure they are.
Were I a senior political figure, let's say in Europe or in East Asia, wherever, I'd be gathering my advisors together, and I think the question I would ask is, okay, folks, is Trump an anomaly? And that his departure from the stage will result in a return to some version of normalcy? Or is Trump indicative of fundamental change in what makes the Americans tick? I don't believe at this point that we can answer that question in a definitive way. But that is a big question. My sense is that the anti-Trumpers, Democratic Party perhaps more broadly, genuinely believe, that with Trump out of the way, the status quo will be restored. I myself don't think that's true. Because I think that the anger and alienation that gave us Trump are not going to be removed simply by removing Trump himself. We got a deeply divided country. It is not a divided country because Donald Trump is president. Donald Trump became president because we have a deeply divided country.
Meaning what? What is the axis of division? Is it has not? Is it red, blue, east, west?
All the above. I mean, we have a country, I believe, I may have my facts slightly wrong here, but I mean, we've got greater inequality, economic inequality in our country today than either we ever have, or at least going back to the Gilded Age of the late 19th century.
But the disadvantaged in that gap are not going to find another Trump.
I'm not arguing that they're going to find another Trump. I'm going to argue that their anger that found expression in Trump being elected president is not going to dissipate just because Trump goes away. They're still going to believe that they are being screwed by an economic system that is fixed in the favor of other people. Similarly, just because Trump goes away doesn't mean that. I think there's an underappreciated anger among those who send their sons and daughters to serve in the military. I think there's underappreciated anger that they have in the way that American soldiers have been abused. And getting rid of Trump is not going to make them feel better. I think that there is perhaps not as definitively articulated. I think that there is at least confusion about the consequences of abandoning traditional moral norms. Mm-hmm. And that simply getting rid of Trump is not going to clarify. It's not going to bring us cultural unity or moral clarity. So my view is that we are stuck in a very profound crisis that gave us Trump, and that getting rid of Trump still is going to find us locked in this crisis. And I think the last point would be, I think what it comes down to in simple terms is that there exists no broadly accepted definition of the common good, a notion of the common good to which all Americans can subscribe, whether they call themselves conservatives or progressives or whatever. I do believe...
Say the action piece of the sentence again. I want you to underline that.
This is like, you're like the reporter from the New Yorker who was giving me a hard time about that interview.
We're going to talk. We'll talk about that.
Yeah,
we'll
that's
come
what
to
I'm
that.
afraid of.
We'll come. No.
Yeah.
I'm going to take you way off the hook on that one. But no, make that point again because I want to.
There is no commonly accepted conception of the common good in our country today, would be my hypothesis. Okay. How would I prove it? I can't prove it, but I think it's true. There was, indeed, during the Cold War. And again, in an ironic sense, the definition of the common good was that we Americans all oppose communism. We Americans believe in freedom and they don't. Now, again, that also was not empirically true, but it was a substitute for truth, and gave an answer to what it meant to be an American.
I want to disagree with you wholeheartedly on that.
You are going to?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I don't think we're that divided a country. Of course, there's both sides of the tracks, and there's rich and poor and whatnot. I think the country's basically moral orientation, social orientation, is fundamentally what it was.
So what's your explanation for how Donald Trump became president?
Well, it'd be a lot like yours. But the whole point is, and this is going to sound like flattery, and I don't mean it that way, I think you are a magnificent embodiment, Andy, of what this country thinks it is and wants to be. Hardworking, regular people with all your life in one manner or another has been about the public space and world in this country, including its military forces. You're a family guy and a believer, which even the non-family, non-believers admire and recognize as stalwart citizen community values. And we love it. We like it. The question in my mind is why we sort of torture ourselves with our doubts about those fundamental qualities and why we don't see more of them in our public life. In other words, nobody wants to be Trump. Nobody likes Trump. The first program we ever did on Trump was realizing that everybody knew a guy like that in high school. The showboat, the millionaire's kid, big car, thought he was the great lady man. Obnoxious, faker, obvious through and through. I remember mine very vividly. But we don't like those people. We like the guy who's working hard to do a job in the public interest. And we still do. And yet, to my mind, where are they? I don't mean exotics or, I'm not talking about fringe or wacky, wonderfully interesting, bizarre people. I'm talking about the bedrock people that you'd ask to help you do a job. I think we still like those, and we don't. I think Trump was I think Bernie would have beaten Donald Trump. I think almost anybody would have beaten Hillary Clinton. She was too long in the public realm without any significant, clear, objective achievement. But she also stood in for a line of Bushes and Bill Clinton, who were pretty much the same thing, a sort of a failed generation of people who were not dealing with...
Well, I think this coming election will allow you to test your hypothesis. That is to say, there are Democrats who, in the race, who, to my mind, pretty much fit with your depiction of, good, honest, decent, hard-working men and women. If one of them gets the nomination, and if that person then wins the presidency, we'll see if that heals our divisions. No, but, if we got Mayor Pete in the White House, will the Trump faction in our country rally around Mayor Pete?
No, they won't, but there are others. He doesn't have to be. I mean, I'm thinking Cory Booker was more to my taste than Mayor Pete, but people who will say, no, we're not going to send home your veterans either in a body bag or a suicide or addicted or ruined. Those are the communities that elected Donald Trump in a rage that these respectable establishment candidates had delivered them war after war after war for what?
I agree with that contributed to why he won, that there are many sources of anger that resulted in Trump's election, and one of them, I think, is anger related to our misguided military policy.
Let's talk about the policy, but also reference the conversation in the New Yorker, which is worth reading.
No, it's not.
No. Well, it was not fair. It was not finished. It really shouldn't have gone out as it was. But it got going on the subject of interventions and isolationism. And it raised the question: is to be an anti-interventionist, isn't there a little bit of a taint of, being Charles Lindbergh,
right,
or World War II, not intervene in the European war, etc. I could tell you, but you could tell everybody what was wrong with that posing of the question.
Well, I do believe that the journalist had an agenda when he began the conversation, and the agenda was going to try to draw a link between anti-interventionism, so-called isolationism, and anti-Semitism, and in the triangle described by those 3 points, I would be right in the middle. Here's what I should have said. It's like 5 points. Point number 1, isolationism is a fiction.
You did say that.
When you think about it, 1776, we declare independence. We achieve independence, 1783? The Treaty of Paris, 13 little colonies have become 13 little states. They're all huddled along the eastern seaboard of North America. Whoosh! By 1945, we're the most powerful and richest country in the world. How'd that happen? The answer is not isolationism. The answer is expansionism. Expansionism through various means, some military, some not. That is the enduring theme of U.S. foreign policy, point number 1. Point number 2, I tried to acknowledge that there was a brief period of time when you might have said we adhered to isolationism. I would prefer anti-interventionism. The brief period of time was roughly between 1938 and December 7th, 1941. Country was split then between intervening in the European war or not intervening. The non-interventionists, I think I said this pretty clearly, deserve to lose that argument. The Nazis in particular, maybe less so the Japanese, the Nazis in particular threatened our security, and they threatened everything we believe in. We needed to go in that war. But it does not follow that the anti-interventionist cause was without basis. Now, the journalist wanted to suggest that the anti-interventionists were all anti-Semites. I said they're not. Yes, there was anti-Semitism among...
You're talking about in today's world.
I'm talking about 1940. That Charles Lindbergh was an anti-Semite. But I think it is deeply unfair and ahistorical to suggest that the America First movement more broadly was motivated by anti-Semitism. It was motivated by a desire not to repeat the experience of a war that had occurred only 20 years before, when we intervened in France in 1917, and 116,000 American lives were lost in a war that lasted a year and a half for nothing. That is to say, the promises, the rationale for intervention, make the world safe for democracy. This will be the last war that ever happens, did not come to pass. And so there were a lot of Americans with reason who said, I don't want to do that again. That's what I failed to explain as clearly as I should. That's not a defense of the anti-interventionists of the late 1930s. It's simply to acknowledge that they had some reason to think what they thought. Now, are anti-interventionists like me, I don't want it to be about me, are anti-interventionists today influenced by anti-Semitism? I know of no evidence to support that whatsoever. I think that the anti-interventionists of today, like me, are influenced by the fact that we have misused American military power and we have abused our soldiers, and to continue down that path, I think, is wrong and deeply immoral.
Well said. But let's move it forward.
Mary is standing behind you. Just so
After
you know.
this question, I just want to open up the questions to...
Can I ask Andy
Sure, go ahead.
one question? And we'll happily do whatever you want. But moving it forward, we haven't resolved any standard of when we intervene or when we don't, whether it's in Haiti or Libya or Somalia, you name it. We could do something for the world if you could give us a kind of Bacevich doctrine, well aware that we savaged Vietnam, we totally wrecked the country of Iraq. Our record is a miserable failure in my lifetime, and yet we are still the biggest guy around, and there are some moments possibly. What would your test be of a rational and even promising test of intervening in other people's?
Well, I think I would begin this way. So we posit a situation where doing nothing is unacceptable. I think I would begin the conversation by saying, well, what can we do that does not require us to use force? Mm-hmm. Because when we use force, our experience tells us, we let loose all kinds of unintended consequences. So are there ways to help, to provide aid and assistance that doesn't require dropping bombs on people? And I think that in many cases, the answer is yes. To put it as bluntly as possible, we are a big country. We are a rich country. Mm-hmm. We can accommodate people in this country that are being victimized. Now, politically, we don't want to accept these people in our country because many of them don't look like you and me. But that really gets to the point that the humanitarian instinct that so often leads to military action is about that deep, right? Mm-hmm. It'll make me feel good if we can do something for these people as long as it doesn't inconvenience me back here in the land of the free and the home of the brave. So again, the point is we feel compelled to act. Are there options available to do not begin with the use of military force? I would want people to answer that question before going any further.
I remember a guy who lives around here suggesting that the standard for intervening on behalf of an aggrieved nation or an embattled nation might be ask what they're doing on their own to improve the next generation's water supply. In other words, we don't go in on oil cases, we don't go in on communist cases of how you run your economy, but there would be another test for me would be, do we go in with others? Can we get no more wars of choice, but wars of coalitions to do such things?
I think that would generally tend to be helpful.
Mary's next.
Yes, I'd like to open up the questions. I'm sure lots of you have questions, so please feel free to ask a single question at the microphone, And just to give you all a bit of confidence, I just wanted to ask you a question myself. Being as we're looping this discussion backwards and forwards from the Cold War, how successful do you think Bernie might be if he didn't call himself a socialist?
You know, sort of electoral politics is not my strong suit. My guess is, even though commentators on the right go nuts with regard to him labeling himself a democratic socialist, my guess is that the average American voter does not react to the word socialism as he or she might have reacted 20, 30, 40 years ago. That was a radioactive term. I don't think it is any longer. And that whatever he calls himself, the extent to which his proposals seem to respond to the problems we're addressing will be much more important than that label will be.
I'm a little puzzled as to how we can talk about the Cold War and the post-Cold War era without mentioning nuclear weapons and the U.S. role right now being the nuclear superpower, the unopposed nuclear superpower. And what this does to the American psyche, the American morale, how do we integrate this into who we are in the world and how we behave in the world? And a part of that is how we think about our military and what we use our military for. You know, you're talking about intervening for humanitarian causes. I see the military-industrial complex, this big, huge, hungry organism that's...
Yeah, but you wanted to talk about nuclear weapons first, right?
I do want to talk about nuclear weapons. So there are two pieces to the conversation. Oh. One is nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons actually holds up our military-industrial complex.
Good question.
Check.
Yeah.
So, I think you are quite correct to call us on not having mentioned nuclear weapons. That said, I'm struck by more broadly the lack of attention to the continued existence of nuclear weapons. Why is that? I think because we've become comfortable with nuclear weapons. You're shaking your head no, but I think maybe the rest of many of your other fellow citizens have. I was struck by, and this is maybe last year, maybe the last 2 years of the Obama administration, that president, having won the Nobel Peace Prize, approved a plan to modernize the American nuclear arsenal. It's going to take till, I think, 2035. It's going to cost $1 trillion. New warheads, new missiles, new submarines, a new bomber. And the amount of press attention that got was quite negligible. And that affirmed to me that nuclear weapons have pretty much fallen off the radar screen. That this is not something that our political class pays much attention to, and therefore it's not something that the American people pay much attention to, with you yourself, of course, excluded from that broad and general statement.
For the past 30 years, we've shot ourselves in the foot with hubris. In the wake of the collapse of the opposition, I'm wondering whether you can think of any example in history where another power has been faced with a similar situation in which it behaved more honorably.
Somebody asked me that just the other day, and I said no. I couldn't think of anything. In other words, that there does seem to be a set of iron laws of international politics to which all powers will adhere. And one of those iron laws, I think, is that when you think you have gained an advantage, exploit the advantage, press the advantage, apparently with the expectation that exploiting the advantage is going to help your situation. That's what we did when the Cold War ended. We did that in particular vis-a-vis Russia, the remnant of the Soviet Union. We did that with the eastward expansion of NATO all the way up to Russia's border, even including former Russian republics. Now, we did it because the good people of Poland and Lithuania, et cetera, deserved the chance to become part of Europe and deserved the chance to feel some sense of security now that Europe had been reunited. I get all that, but we did it with negligible consideration for how that would, how the Soviets would respond, or Russians would respond. There were people at the time, George Kennan notably, who said, don't do this. This is a huge mistake, but we went ahead and we did it. And I think that if you're looking for one important explanation for Putin's animosity toward us, his maneuvering to try to take any advantage he can to embarrass the United States, to gain an edge, I think the expansion of NATO eastward is a real good place to begin understanding that.
Great. So what do we do now in the wake of the harvest of our hubris, going beyond Chris's point about the Bacevich doctrine, looking at the
I think we stop expanding. I mean, if you want to know how Ukraine came to be the nexus of crisis, it's because that we were sending signals, the Ukrainians were sending signals that they were going to join NATO. I mean, this would be the equivalent of Mexico. No, forget that. Be the equivalent of Cuba forging an alliance with the Soviet Union in 1960 and 1961. There was no way that the United States was not going to react in a hostile way toward Cuba entering the Soviet orbit. We've done the same thing.
Neither of you mentioned that Hillary won the election, the popular vote, and
that's not particularly germane.
I know
because
it's a
the way our
side issue.
Constitution works, it doesn't matter
We have this
who wins the
stupid
popular
electoral
vote.
college.
It matters who wins the electoral college.
Well, what do you think about the electoral college? I think it's really stupid.
I believe that it ought to have been abolished some time ago. I am not aware of the Hillary Clinton campaign in the run-up to the election of people saying, oh my gosh, we want to abolish the electoral college. Rather, their campaign was calculating how many states they were going to win so that they could be put beyond whatever the number is, 287. So this ends up being, I don't mean this to you personally, but it really is kind of sour grapes. She lost the election. There's all kinds of reasons why she lost. She lost the election.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. About a month after the invasion of Iraq, I heard George Shultz giving a lecture at MIT on the occasion of being given an award in the humanities by a member of the MIT Corporation, in which he said, sort of out of nowhere, about the invasion of Iraq, we proved we could do it. Amazing. And in the light of some of your comments tonight, my question is, when Soleimani was murdered or assassinated, right away there were leaders of the Democratic Party who said, he's a murderer, he murdered at least 600 of our troops, et cetera, and New York Times reporters, it's almost as if the editors insisted that phrase be dropped into every story. He's a murderer and he's responsible for the murder of at least 600 of our troops. And at one point there was a reference to Petraeus, a truly honorable man who's never been convicted of anything, saying he was the source for this alleged fact of Soleimani being responsible for the murder of 600 American soldiers. Could you comment on that?
Well, I don't want to be a General Soleimani apologist. I mean, some of you know my son was killed in Iraq. But let's get serious here, okay? 9/11 happens. There are no Iranian hijackers out of the 19. President Bush and his administration decides that he's going to embark upon a great war in the Middle East. Primary target is Iraq. Expectation is if we get rid of Saddam, we're going to pacify Iraq and other good things will follow. In framing the war that is going to become, that is about to come, the administration declares that the larger target of this war is an axis of evil. That word axis, of course, is loaded. Right? We're hearkening back to the other time we went against the axis. And Iran is designated part of this axis of evil. They didn't participate in 9/11. Matter of fact, it is a fact that as the Americans were ginning up preparations to intervene in Afghanistan, there were direct talks, maybe not direct, there were talks, whether direct or indirect, with Iranian authorities asking if Iran would provide certain assistance in that campaign. I believe it related specifically to the recovery of any downed American aviators in the coming fight against Afghanistan. They signed up. So we then invade Iraq, a neighboring country to Iran. We occupy Iraq. We turn Iraq into a total mess. And Iran responds by trying to complicate that occupation, by trying to increase the penalty that the Americans are going to pay for their folly in invading Iran's neighbor and in blaming Iran somehow for 9/11. I think that, from the point of view of killing Americans, this is a terrible, terrible thing. I think it is utterly understandable on their part. So I'm not sticking up for I am not one of the people who mourns Soleimani's death. But we need to be serious about the politics that we have plunged into. And at this stage of the game, to somehow make the case that how terrible it is that innocent Americans have been killed is quite a whitewash and really is pretty contemptible.
You talked about hubris and your youth and why you didn't do better, why you didn't see what truly was going on. And you talked about how will I answer grandchildren if they ask me what I did. How would you coach grandchildren?
How do I coach them?
What would you say to them to help them to try to avoid getting caught in the same hubris and sucked in by the idea of American exceptionalism?
Well, I don't think that my grandchildren are at an age where I can have that conversation with them right now. Maybe our granddaughter. We haven't had that conversation. Maybe I should. I'm not sure she'd be responsive to kind of heavy talk coming from her grandfather. The truth is, I don't know. You know, the New York Times has got this new 1619 series about slavery. And it's become, I think, fairly commonplace to describe slavery as the original sin. I'm not trying to pick an argument with that. And I'm not sure if theologically you can have more than one original sin. You probably can't. But I am of a mind that American exceptionalism is our original sin. That this deep-seated claim that we are the chosen people, called upon to change the world and remake it in our image, this is an abiding theme. You might have thought that the debacle of Vietnam would have purged that inclination from our collective consciousness, but it did not. By the time Ronald Reagan became president, it was back. And as long as we continue to believe that, I think that we will continue to blunder. And we will be immune to learning. That's a pretty pessimistic statement, but I think it may well be true.
At the risk of being too churchy in the words of Mr. Lydon, and we have two former altar boys, I understand. I wanted to ask a theological question, not really, but it was made by a Catholic priest. He was a war resistor. He was a poet. Daniel Berrigan once said, "We have to sacrifice as much for peace as we would for war." And Professor Bacevich has made the observation that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there should have been repentance, not celebration. Mm-hmm. So here in the bluest city, in the bluest state, so proximate to the incubator of our foreign military, political, legal establishments, what can we do individually to repent, and what can our country do collectively to repent? I'm going to sit down. Thank you.
Go ahead, Chris.
You're asking me?
Well, he was asking both of us.
I don't know. We should pray more. We should be more reflective about our own private but public sins. We should remind ourselves every day of our place in the universe, and it's a blessed one, and it's also a humble one. I'm not a preacher. I am a believer, happily, but look in the mirror. I mean, and also, we should be held accountable. My great model, and I think he means a great deal to Aunty too, is William James. William James, who invented the idea of pragmatism. It's all tied up in accountability, reviewing what you've done as a nation, as a community, and sorting out the disasters from the successes, and making things that work. And also judging an idea is to be judged by its results. And if it keeps banging into military, moral, political, global disaster, we've got to question that idea. I don't, it's a deep question. Who calls not only sinners, but destructive forces to account? But we don't do it much anymore.
So when I was being raised as a young altar boy and being taught by the nuns,
as was I,
a lot of emphasis on the notion of vocation, positing that we each as individuals have a vocation, called upon to play a role. And the nuns basically said, hey, you need to think seriously to find what your vocation is, so you can find your place, so you can make your contribution. Of course, that went right by me.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't.
I think I wasted a considerable part of my life doing things that drew me away from my vocation. I think my vocation is to be a writer. Now, that doesn't mean I have no expectation of changing the world in any significant way. But it seems to me that's where I can make some kind of a contribution. Other people have different vocations. I mean, they're called upon to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless. They're called upon to take care of the sick. They're called upon to be cops and firefighters. Maybe they're called into business, but then they're called to be ethical in their behavior in business. So I have really come to the conclusion, and this is another one of my shortcomings as a young person, that deep and sustained reflection to identify one's own vocation is really, I think, a crucially important precondition to becoming a mature adult. It's not just sort of the first thing that appeals to you. If it would have been, then I would have ended up as a professional basketball player.
Thank you very much for the conversation, and also, Mr. Bacevich, for your writing ever since this terrible agony of the forever war settled in to become our life. I just wanted to ask you a question slightly different, because it's not about Trump and America, and it's based on purely anecdotal evidence. But I spent about 4 months this year in Western Europe, in Germany, in France, and England, and I also have a good friend that I've helped out of Mosul a couple of times, who's Iraqi. And what I heard from almost everyone where I was traveling, I wasn't talking, except when I was talking to fellow academics in a small, contained space. But whenever I would just have a conversation with a taxi driver, or a bartender, or a public intellectual friend of mine, or what, I kept finding, to my surprise, the common thing to do is to apologize for Trump when politics comes up. And in fact, I ran into enthusiast after enthusiast, people from all walks of life in all those countries, and particularly this last week from my friend in Iraq, who is delighted with Mr. Trump because Obama, as she said, gave Iraq away. She is a professor and an accomplished one. So it seems to me that, though I'm sure you're right, that in the halls of power outside America, everyone is bewailing Trump. It isn't just in, like, the Philippines and Brazil, where regular people like him. And that doesn't have so much to do with the American experience of the Cold War and the post-war power.
So
I just wonder if you think about this.
Bring it to a question.
Yes, we've got a lot for you.
If you can, sorry.
I was in the middle of asking the question. I was saying, although it doesn't have to do with America, I wonder if you had some thoughts about why the Trump phenomenon and Trump himself are in fact popular in places like our closest allies in Western Europe, and not only among the so-called underinformed. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that there is pretty clear historical evidence that demagogues have appeal to certain populations. I don't know that I can explain why that is, why that phenomenon occurs, but it does occur. I personally believe that Trump is a remarkably weak president who rarely actually follows through on the bluster-filled talk, but he does at least give the appearance of a strong man, and there are those who gravitate to that. And I think that's probably something of what's going on with the recent surge of sort of right-wing dictator types in various countries around the world.
I just wanted to ask your thoughts about the American intervention, I think successful but flawed, in Bosnia and Kosovo. And what could be learned from that? Is there a lesson that we've missed? Is there something that's not our hubris? What could we have taken from that?
I think one would take that local conditions really, really, really matter, and that the conditions in Bosnia and in Kosovo were such that relatively minor use of force could bring about the desired political outcome, that the decision to keep U.S. occupation forces in place was one that the U.S. forces maintained a fairly low profile, and their presence was abbreviated. I don't remember the dates, but we sort of got the Americans out and turned things over to other NATO or other allied forces. So specific conditions mean everything, I think, is what I would say is the lesson.
There exists a horrid equation whose form is always changing, the purpose of which is to produce a number. This number describes how much you need to spend compared to your opponent in order to assure victory. How can any democracy survive if that number is known?
If that number is what?
Known.
Known.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise. Did you just say that we can identify a number of spending that will enable a candidate to win?
Yes.
Maybe I'm totally off base here, but I thought that Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump substantially, and she lost.
But did she spend it effectively?
Absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, good. And what is effective spending of political monies? I don't know. Because then you get into complicated questions about social media, and that's way outside my frame of reference. I don't think I can answer your question.
Thank you. I just want to ask a question about the nature of the U.S. empire. And now in 2020, it seems many people may be kind of coming to view. We're starting to wonder whether our wars in the greater Middle East have in fact ever been meant to be won or to build anything at all, or whether they've been meant intended to destroy and to be maintained.
I'm sorry, so have our wars built the American empire? Is that the question?
The nature of the U.S. empire.
The nature of the U.S. empire.
Whether these wars have in fact been meant to build something, as you say, democracy and freedom, or whether in fact they've been intended from the beginning to destroy something and to be maintained, as you say, forever wars.
I mean, as a broad statement, I would say that U.S. purposes in the post-9/11 wars have changed over time. That as it became apparent that the declared purposes were not going to be achieved, then the people in charge came up with another explanation of why we're there. I think this is clearly true. For example, in the Afghanistan war, when we intervened, there was a great deal of optimistic talk about nation building, state building in Afghanistan, democracy, women's rights, creating a legitimate government, effective security forces. From one year to the next, as those goals slip further and further away, I think that our purposes were redefined. As far as I can tell, our goals in Afghanistan today are simply to figure out a way to get out without instant collapse ensuing. In other words, what we want to do is get out and allow for a decent interval, familiar phrase, to pass before the inevitable happens and the Afghanistan government succumbs. And then we will be able to say, well, we did our best. The outcome is not our fault.
Maybe I'll say very briefly, part of the reason I asked the question was, and maybe
you got like 5 people behind you, and I think that they want to wrap it up.
Dr. Bacevich, thank you. That you've laid out what I think is a very compelling and thought-provoking argument about the problems that have arisen by the United States adopting beliefs in globalization, in U.S. military supremacy, in individual freedom unmoored from shared values, and in the U.S. president as a leader of the world. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you think we might be able to do as a culture to adopt a more productive and more hopeful set of beliefs that could point us in a better direction for the future.
Yeah, we need to recover, in my judgment, we need to recover some conception of the common good that will be a set of values, purposes, goals to which we can all, most of us, subscribe, therefore healing our divisions. I think there is an obvious candidate to do so, and the candidate is climate change. The climate change threatens all of us as Americans, threatens us as inhabitants of the planet. That threat is becoming more challenging with every passing day, and that is something that we should all be able to agree upon as necessary to guarantee some kind of a decent future for our children and our grandchildren. But our political leaders kind of do a lot of talking, not a lot of action. I kind of understand why, because in my judgment, if we're going to deal with climate change, it's going to result in very serious sacrifice that will be required of each of us as individuals. American people are not into sacrifice.
A study by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan of over 300 conflicts between 1900 and I think around 2006 indicates that nonviolent strategies and tactics work better than military ones. If that's the case, how do we get from militarism to nonviolence in dealing with international struggles?
I'm not sure that everybody agrees with that study. I mean, it seems to me that, I don't want to pick on the Israelis in particular, but it seems to me that the Israelis don't particularly believe in nonviolence as a way to deal with what they see as their immediate threats, Palestinians. That they believe that coercion works better. I'm not sticking up for that point of view, but it seems to me in practical politics, there are those who argue in favor of nonviolence, but I don't think there's really a consensus that nonviolence is superior to violence. Maybe there ought to be, but there's not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the very last question.
Well, what do you think of the idea that if we get over our concept of scarcity and get over to a concept of abundance, and that we get past like 40% of the the American public not having enough, getting, how do I say it? Not having enough money to pay a $400 bill without like borrowing or something like that, or 69% living paycheck to paycheck and things like that. If we can build strength here, that we can have a more concentrated and more cohesive effect abroad. How do you think about that?
I think you're exactly, precisely correct. That is to say, that if we are able to demonstrate that a society based on liberal democratic values is able to meet the needs of its citizens more effectively than other systems, that will, I think, over time, bring other nations to agree and adopt that approach. That would, in other words, we would be trying to set an example that others from which others might profit.
Oh, can I have a follow-up question? What do you think about universal basic income as a means to do that?
I'm not enough of an economist to be able to judge whether or not that's practical or not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.